This week on The Record, the Show Me State shows up for Donald Trump. Nikki Haley heads into Super Tuesday without claiming a single delegate in the Missouri caucuses. Haley's supporters were outnumbered, but outspoken. Can Trump eventually win them over? A Trump critic, Missouri Republican Shamed Dogan, is on the record. State Senator Mary Elizabeth Coleman supported Trump in Jefferson County. She comes on the record to discuss her run for Congress, her role in crafting Missouri's abortion ban, access to IVF, and the ballot drive to protect abortion in the state constitution. It's all coming up right now. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. President Donald Trump swept the Missouri caucuses on Saturday. His victory bringing him one step closer to appearing on the Missouri ballot in November, perhaps alongside questions that would either overturn the state's abortion ban or make it harder to change the Constitution. The author of that abortion ban, State Senator Mary Elizabeth Coleman, is now on the record. Thank you for joining us. How do you describe President Trump's claim to the Republican base in Missouri, claiming all of the delegates at stake in Missouri? What is that thing?
Sure. So I think you just saw a dominating win by President Trump, and what you see is really a resonating with the base. Missourians are pretty frustrated. They are ready to fire Joe Biden, and when they look at somebody who, under his leadership, we had a strong economy, we had a secure border, and people are just fed up. And I think that there's a lot of people who just love President Trump. When
you consider the impact of President Trump's term in office, where would you rank his influence on reshaping the Supreme Court and their ultimate decision to overturn Roe v. Wade? Where does that fit into the Trump legacy?
For somebody who, like me, has been a pro-life activist my entire life, it's got to be at the very top of the list. This is really the culmination of a 30-year fight to try to reshape the judiciary, to have people who are not legislating from the bench, people who are trying to interpret our founding documents the way that they were written. This idea that there's somehow a living constitution is garbage. Our constitution should be read under the four corners as it was written and as it's amended under the process that's put in place. And so Trump has an incredible legacy, but it's not just for overturning Roe, but it's for strong Second Amendment support in the New York case. It's about ending the deep state and pushing back against this bureaucracy that's going to expand past what the legislative intent of law was federally. So it's a huge part of his appeal and his victory.
Many in our audience may know that you were integral, key in helping to write Missouri's abortion ban, often considered one of the most stringent in the nation. Would you like to see Missouri's abortion ban become the model nationwide? Would you vote for a federal law of the same kind?
So listen, I would do anything and everything I can to protect the life of the unborn, and I'm certainly happy to advance that. We do not have the support nationally right now to implement the kind of protections that we have for women and children in the state of Missouri.
But you're running for Congress to have a voice in that.
Absolutely, but when you look at the landscape, there isn't a majority of voices across the country to enact that kind of legislation.
72% of Republicans and 84% of voters nationwide supported giving a rape victim legal access to an abortion in a recent poll conducted just last year by Marist. Where do you think that number sits in Missouri?
I don't know. What I know is that women who have been violated in that way deserve every protection of the law, and people who commit those horrendous crimes should be put in jail for, just throw away the key. We have got to do a better job protecting women from the violence of rape. When we have people who are wanting to use rape victims as a talking point to legalize up-to-birth abortion on demand, paid for by taxpayers for any reason, I find that really reprehensible, because we should be focusing on punishing the criminals who are hurting women.
They're not the vast majority of abortion cases, but they are some of the cases, so they're important to mention.
Well, and we should listen to the voices of the women who have conceived through rape. People like my friend Rebecca Kissinger, who says she should have a voice to be talking about this issue, and she talks about how her life has value. She was conceived through rape, and so again, this is really horrible to be using as a talking point for the left, a small portion of abortions, to legalize up-to-birth abortion on demand, paid for by the taxpayers. That's the radical position.
I was asking about the percentage of support because, as you know, the Missouri Senate right now is talking about changing the threshold of public support that would be necessary to change the Constitution.
People who are talking about initiative petition reform, which is a terrible acronym. I think that it makes it really confusing. Initiative petition reform sounds like a problem you're having with your internet service provider or your computer.
Why now? Why now when there is this big push?
Well, I've been working on it since I've been in the State House, and I think that people have been working on it for a long time.
Would you vote to protect in vitro fertilization or IVF in federal law?
So right now, well, in federal law, those are states' issues that have been typically funded. Those have not been done at the federal level. And in Missouri, we have some of the most permissive IVF and surrogacy laws in the country, and so there isn't really a need to do anything legislative there.
I'm not so sure. Do you think, for example, a Missouri court might reasonably reach the same conclusion that the Supreme Court did in Atlanta about IVF?
I don't think so.
I meant to say Alabama, pardon me.
No, I don't think so. And you know that because back in 1986 is when Missouri put into, by Democrats in the State House, into our founding documents that we believe that life begins at conception. And since that time, we have had IVF used by families to build their to be able to build their families and parents since that time. Louisiana actually was one of the first places that put in IVF laws back in 1987. And so if the courts were going to find a problem with the statutes and the things that have been legal, they would have done so at some point in the last almost 35 years.
How could they when the new Missouri abortion ban that took effect in 2021 was written in 2019? The courts haven't litigated that new law yet.
They have litigated it. In fact, they litigated it. And what's interesting is that no, but somebody would have filed a piece of lawsuits that happened. So that law, the Missouri Stands for the Unborn Act that I'm the architect of, was put in place in 2019. And we would have seen litigation be filed since then. And it's important to note, I think, too, that the Alabama case that you're talking about, if you read it, was actually brought by parents who had been working, I mean, really had given their treasure and their pain and their longing for a child to fertility doctors who really violated that trust by not having basic protections put in place. And so if Missouri was going to do something, they would have needed to already address it.
I want to get specific on the law, though, because the portion of the law that you sponsored and helped to craft, it defines an abortion as the act of basically acting with intent to destroy either the life of an embryo.
It doesn't say the life of an embryo.
Fetus, I'm quoting directly, or fetus in his or her mother's womb. Do you read that as embryo in mother's womb?
So you have left out, as often the mainstream media does, important pieces in the definition. So a viable pregnancy is required to be able to have a termination of a pregnancy. And so one of the things that we talk about, and actually we just had a hearing on this last week in the Health and Welfare Committee in the State Senate, is when you have abortion defined positively as ending the life of a viable pregnancy, you don't have to go back in and do all of these negative definitions. And so you're kind of pulling a piece of that. An embryo in that section is talking about a viable pregnancy, which is a part that you didn't read in the legislation.
I want to be clear, I did read and research all that, and I did see some portions of the law that refer to a viable pregnancy in the mother's womb.
That's under the very definition of abortion under section 210065. So you're going to have to read all of it together. I know it's tempting to kind of pick the pieces out to kind of try to get fear-mongering or try to make points,
but
I want to make it really clear that IVF is legal in the state of Missouri, surrogacy laws are legal in the state of Missouri, and there is no need to address those issues.
Just to be clear, that law defines an unborn child as, and it goes on to use the term embryo, so it defines an embryo as an unborn child.
As a viable pregnancy. So yes, as an embryo, as part of a viable pregnancy.
When people look at this big national law, they compare the written English language of the Alabama law to the Missouri law. They look at the court opinion and they see similarities. I think it raises fair questions. This question will clarify it. If someone was to come to you, one of your colleagues in the Senate, and said, hey, I think this language could make it crystal clear that IVF is protected in Missouri and could improve upon any confusion that may exist in the current statute. Would you support that?
Here's what I would say is you have to look very carefully at what's written. What Alabama has recently passed is the legislature is trying to address the concerns of parents in light of the Supreme Court ruling. But if you look at the language that they have recently passed, and I think the governor may sign, there's real concerns because they've gotten rid of all negligence suits for fertility doctors who are not following the law, and we don't want families who are hurt to not have a cause of action. So the way that you word these things is exceptionally important.
Okay.
And because it's broadly legal right now, I wouldn't want to enact something that might actually make it harder for a family who would receive malpractice in their medical practice to be able to be made whole.
we'd have to see the language, is what you're saying.
Because right now it's broadly legal, and I wouldn't want to accidentally have something done that would take away the ability for a family who is harmed to be made whole.
So there's no immediate threat to IVF in Missouri as you see it, and until the courts would come and try to throw that into question, that would be the catalyst. I think I understand you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We continue the conversation in an expanded interview with Senator Coleman on our website on KSDK.com. In just a moment, a Missouri Republican critical of Donald Trump and how an honorary member of the Ku Klux Klan managed to file papers to run for governor in Missouri. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey is suing a Planned Parenthood clinic in Columbia, Missouri. Bailey cites a man from the right-wing Project Veritas who took an undercover video while interacting with that Planned Parenthood and workers in that clinic about an imaginary patient who doesn't exist in real life. The man pretended he had a 13-year-old niece, pregnant, who needed to travel to Kansas for an abortion. Planned Parenthood says that video was heavily doctored and selectively edited. They claim they do not provide any direct form of transportation for minor patients across state lines, and they say they comply with state laws that require parental consent. We talked to Bailey's Republican primary challenger, Will Scharf.
I think Bailey's office has unfortunately dropped the ball on a number of other lawsuits against Planned Parenthood, against abortion clinics. I think they're trying to be more aggressive now going forward. I'm interested to see how that case proceeds.
Would you have brought this case with those facts?
I think the allegations brought to light by Project Veritas are deeply, deeply troubling. I think there's certainly a potential that criminal acts were committed, and if so, they need to be prosecuted in full.
This week, an Illinois judge ordered former President Donald Trump's name removed from the ballot there, even as early voting is already underway. Attorneys for Trump quickly appealed that ruling, and right now his name remains on the ballot, but the question remains on what may happen next. When we come back, Shamed Dogan is on the record. Campaign season officially kicked off in Missouri last week as filing opened for candidates to appear on the August primary ballot. But the start of the campaign season brought with it an embarrassing blunder for Missouri Republicans. When former House Republican Shamed Dogan tweeted this: "Hey, Missouri GOP, I just learned the candidate listed first on our primary ballot for governor is a cross-burning KKK member who ran for U.S. Senate 2 years ago and freely admits his KKK membership and white supremacist beliefs." The state party later responded and said Darryl McClanahan's affiliation with the Ku Klux Klan fundamentally contradicts our party's values and platform, and announced they're pushing forward to try to remove him from the ballot as a Republican candidate. Former House Republican Shamed Dogan is now on the record. How did this come to your attention, and how could this happen?
So I saw this posted on the social media account of one of my former colleagues, a Democratic state rep, who was contrasting the Democrats not allowing the filing fee for State Representative Sarah Unsicker after some questionably anti-Semitic remarks, and saying, look, the Republicans have this guy who's literally a cross burner. And I saw that on filing day and was, just really confused.
Yeah, Democrats had moved swiftly to make that action to bar one of their former members from filing as a Democrat in that governor's race over the concerns you mentioned about her affiliation with anti-Semitic stances. They might have had more of a heads up because that happened months ago. How much of the responsibility lies with the Republican Party here to vet these things in advance or ahead of time before a candidate files?
Well, it's really hard on day one of filing. I believe there were close to 500 people who filed total. And so if the party had known ahead of time or had been given some kind of heads up, I have no doubt that they would have rejected his filing fee, because there was a state rep candidate on the west side of the state who had some questionable remarks and was removed in 2022. So there's clearly precedent for that.
Beyond this embarrassing instance, to the bigger rhetoric picture, I'm curious how you want Republicans to talk about race in politics.
Well, I think they need to be sane on these issues, and we need to draw lines. I think one of the unfortunate things about the Trump era is that the window of acceptable behavior and acceptable stances on race has kind of moved in a really negative direction. And so people like this feel like they can feel comfortable in the Republican Party. And I think from the top down, we've got to start sending more messages that this is just not acceptable, period, full stop.
What signal do you think it sent when Donald Trump recently compared his 4 criminal indictments to the experience many Black Americans may have faced of discrimination in the criminal justice system?
It was horrible. I mean, the way he keeps talking about there's a 2-tiered system of justice, and somehow he is the biggest victim of the criminal justice system, not all the poor people, not all the minorities, not all the people who've been wrongfully convicted, when he hasn't even been convicted of anything. I think that is not the way to go.
You don't think his experience tracks with or compares with that of a Black American who suffered in the criminal justice system experience, but does that rhetoric, who does that rhetoric
resound with? Who's responding to that?
I don't know. I really don't think it's that helpful with people.
In another example, Attorney General Andrew Bailey is suing local school districts right now. Some of them stress the need to hire more black teachers. Bailey, he's not suing them. He sent a letter that has a legal threat in it. Let me make that correction. But in it, he claimed that their pursuit or implementation of any kind of a racial quota, and we're not sure that a racial quota actually existed in their hiring, just to stress the measurement of it and the progress in it, he claimed that in itself would be racist. Is a positive act of recruiting an underrepresented group also a negative act that has harm to the career advancement of the majority population?
No, not at all. I think there's a huge distinction legally and morally between quotas, which are legal and which almost nobody supports, and between saying that we ought to go out and try and find an applicant pool that's more diverse. Just saying that wherever talent is, we're going to find it. And if people are qualified, no matter what race they are, they should be able to be teachers or be able to be hired for whatever.
That's part of the public rhetoric right now, though, around this conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, woke ideology. Some conservative commentators criticize it as being implemented anywhere from cockpits to hospital rooms. Do you see any inherent bias or problem in measuring that demographic information or medical outcomes even among racial groups to try and identify the source of a problem? Is that allowed?
Yeah, because there are legitimate differences in the way that people are treated by lots of different systems, particularly the way a lot of African American women who are going through childbirth are, where they have disparities in their death rates. So stuff like that, you really need to take a close look at how they're being treated differently by doctors and by the whole system.
So you've identified a problem. How does society go about doing something about it without crossing this undefined red line in the Republican Party rhetoric right now?
Well, you have to make sure that people have equal opportunity and that people are being treated equally and fairly by the law and by the rest of society. And when you see disparities like those, where pregnant women of a certain race are dying at much higher rates than anybody else, there's no natural reason for that. So
it's a policy problem.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, former House Republican Shamed Dogan. Wish we had more time, but thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
We're back in just a moment. Before we go, a lot of our viewers and Missouri caucus goers asked why Missouri abandoned the primary process this year, where you used to fill out a ballot in the privacy of a voting booth, and instead scrapped that for the more confrontational caucus process. We observed something similar take place in the Iowa caucus this year, but watch what happened in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District Saturday when a woman named Laura Villa stood up and criticized Donald Trump.
I am here to nominate Nikki Haley.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, the lady is speaking. Let's afford her the decorum that we all should.
After Donald Trump refused to support the Capitol Police officers, 2 of them committed suicide.
Afterwards, Phil Schrader sent me this email, a man in the bleachers there. He said, I recall going to a polling station in the past for my primary vote. That was a lot simpler and less confrontational than yesterday's caucus proceedings. Would you please advise me of whom in Jefferson City I can voice my opinion with? Phil's a proud father of 2 members of the U.S. military. Turns out his daughter Abby serves in the U.S. Navy and his daughter Mia serves in the U.S. Army. Phil beamed with pride as he told me about their dedication and service to our country, and I imagine they might have beamed with pride too if they could have seen what our cameras missed. During a lull in the action there in that gym, after some tense moments between Trump and Haley supporters, Phil piped up. He didn't have a microphone, but you could hear him from across the bleachers as he shouted to 1,000 of his neighbors that, quote, China and Russia are our enemies, not Democrats and Republicans, and then urged the crowd to unite. I was struck by what he said, so I wrote it down, and later, as it happened, Phil approached me, and I asked him, why was he so concerned with American unity?
I don't care who you are. We've got to work together here. That's the biggest threat I see. And my daughters are in the military. Of course, I'm biased. I don't want a hot war. I want all the material they need to defeat our enemies. I'm friends with Democrats as I am with Republicans. We're not the enemies. It's the foreign adversaries that are enemies, and we've got to figure that out here. I have a West Point grad from 22. She did a deployment in Poland. That wasn't pleasant. She was training, her group was training Ukrainians older than me to fight because the young guys are dead now. And then my other daughter served for 2 years in the South China Sea on an LHA. In the South China Sea, it's contested as well. So we've got it good here. I want to keep that.
A good reminder of what's at stake from someone whose family has skin in the game. Phil's takeaway after all that was to speak of courage. He emailed me to say, quote, "I regret now that I did not speak on behalf of Haley after Laura Villa bravely did." That's all our time. We'll be back here next week. And until then, we're off the record.